Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, I am Pranay and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. And I have with me today Sarthak, who is our in-house public finance expert. So Sarthak, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. And I wanted to do a follow-up episode on an episode you and Suman had already recorded a few days ago on freebies. And there has been a lot of discussion, political commentary, etc. on that topic. So let's begin there. What was your main takeaway from the last episode that you had done on freebies?
So, thanks, Pranay, for introducing me. But that was very kind of you to introduce me like that. Yeah, so we had an episode on freebies, and the main contention or main issue that is going on right now is how much subsidy should be provided. Again, the Supreme Court, the case is going on around in Supreme Court about the same. So, if you look at this entire thing, one of the major issue is macroeconomic stability. The union government is kind of responsible for macroeconomic stability. So maybe the union government has some say on the way expenditures are made, obviously at the union level and also at the state level. But at the state level, again, the kind of expenditure the states make, the state governments are also responsible to their citizens, and they might decide on what they need to provide and what they don't need to provide. But the kind of spending that they incur, it might have an impact on the macroeconomic stability, right, of the entire country. So as a result of which, you have both these things at play, both these dynamics at play, and you have to decide, right? The union government might have a say over all these things. And when it comes to the role of the government, right? We discussed about that as well. Ideally, what should the government be doing? Government should ideally be providing for public goods and merit goods. Public goods are those goods which do not have a market. Missing markets are there, the case of missing markets. And when it comes to the merit goods, these are the goods which have some form of positive externality. So ideally, this should be the case, but that is not usually the case. The kind of relationship that exists between the governments and the people vote for their governments and they might demand some, they might have certain kind of demands. The kind of political incentives that are there, as a result of which private goods are also provided. User charges are not levied on some of these private goods, and it leads to a bunch of things, right? The debts of different states will be very high, and all these things can have an impact on the overall macroeconomic stability. So this is what we had been discussing in the last episode.
Great. Yeah. So I think let's do a follow-up on this and discuss some of the public finance aspects of it, and when I was trying to read about it, gladly we came across a paper by Dr. Rao and Sudipto Mandal. And Dr. Rao has been counselor of Takshashila and he has been our guru in public finance. So the best part of it is there is a landmark study by him itself on subsidies way back in 1991. And thereafter, people at NIPFP, including Dr. Mandal, have done follow-up studies on subsidies to look at how subsidies have changed over the years from that 1991 studies to 2015-16. So I thought it will be good if we can give our listeners an overview of how has that subsidy bill panned out, and is there really a problem with subsidies? So what do you say?
Yeah, so again, if you look at the analysis of both the papers, right? Yes, they find out that government at this point of time, they provide a large amount of subsidy. And one number that was kind of interesting is the total tax revenue for India is around 18% of its GDP, and the total expenditure is around 29% of the GDP. This includes both the union government and the state government, right? So tax revenues are around 18%. And yes, there will be some non-tax revenue as well, but non-tax revenue typically tend to be very low. And the total expenditure that is being incurred is around 29% of the total GDP, right? So there is a deficit here, right? And yes, obviously subsidies will be large part of the deficit. So this is something which is a cause of concern. Now, second thing is, how do we measure subsidies, or what is the total extent of subsidies? Usually what happens is, whatever is part of the budget, the union budget or the state budget, right, there will be certain heads which will be like explicit subsidy, right? These are basically those things which try to increase the consumption of a particular good. For example, food. So there will be subsidy on food. The idea behind this is, people should consume appropriate amount of food. Maybe the consumption of food is less, and through certain subsidies you are trying to ensure that consumption of food increases. Similarly, for fertilizer there will be subsidies. So these are all different elements which you will find within the budget, and you can compute the extent of it. But the thing is, this is just a part of the overall spending. This is the revenue expenditure. If you try to find out what is the total amount the government is spending on subsidies, it is more than that. Right? The cost the government incurs is more than the total revenue expenditure. And this amount again becomes large.
Right. So I think let's rewind a bit and look at the mega picture here, right? So the big picture from these studies is that India does have a subsidy and freebie problem. And by freebies, we define as money that goes into non-merit subsidies. And the extent of that, if we define that as freebies, and then from these papers, we know that the non-merit subsidies totally are up to 6% of India's GDP, right? So that is, if the total union government spending is around, it was around 13-14%, out of it 6% GDP is just going on non-merit subsidies. So that's a huge number, like for comparison, every year on defense expenditure we are just spending 2% GDP, even though there is so much happening on the border and the strategic challenge that China poses, but thrice that amount we are spending on non-merit subsidies. So that's really a big takeaway, and I think listeners should realize that we do have a subsidy problem and we need to do something about it. Maybe Supreme Court intervening is not the best way in that, but we will discuss a few solutions to that, right? So with that, right, let's come to the definition of subsidies and non-merit subsidies and all that, right? So first of all, Sarthak, do you agree with this definition? A freebie is equal to a non-merit subsidy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, again, I mean, this term freebie, who has coined? I mean, I'm not sure there is any such term like a freebie, or there is any universal.
No, there is no, but we have created it. It is there in the public discourse. So it is important that
Yeah,
we
makes
need to define it. I'm sure no one defined a subsidy also.
Some-
Like someone
yeah.
came up with that at some point.
Yeah, in that case, yes, a non-merit subsidy basically is one which is not creating any form of positive externality, and again, government is just spending money on it, right? So in that case, yes, I'll say that okay, it's a freebie.
Good. So, given that you have conceded what
Yeah.
a freebie is, now let's go to what is a subsidy, right? And I thought these papers had a very elegant definition of a subsidy. What they said is that any unrecovered cost on social and economic service can be defined as a subsidy. So this is a really nice and short definition. Now, what does it include, right? First of all, people who look at budgets would know that the government provides broadly three types of services: administrative services, social services, and economic services. So example of administrative services are generally services which the money that government spends on itself, and that could be, let's say, for policing, for say the legislative assembly or the parliament, even on the courts, judiciary, etc., right? So that is administrative. Social services are services like health, education. These are classic examples of social services that government provides. And economic services are services that government provides for increasing economic activity, right? So whether government is doing irrigation or setting up an industrial park, the money spent on that comes under economic services. Now, to define subsidies, we need to look at where the money under these three heads can be classified as a subsidy. Now, the good thing they try to do is that the money spent on administrative services cannot be classified as a subsidy because sort of there is no alternative to that, right? So, for example, the money that government spends on policing can't be classified as a subsidy because there's no other agency which you would want to do policing for, right? Apart from the legitimate authority which has a monopoly over the use of force, which is the Indian state. So all things which go under administrative services can be put out of this definition as a subsidy. So that's why they say unrecovered costs on social and economic services. Another interesting thing is, by the same definition, what they're saying is, for something to be classified as subsidy, the government should have provided a service, and then the cost of providing that services are not completely recovered. Only then can it be classified as a subsidy, which means this definition excludes certain kinds of money which we might think of as subsidies, but they aren't in this definition. For example, direct transfers, right? So if the government gives NREGS funds, or if government gives money through PM Kisan, etc., these are counted as direct transfers and not subsidy, because the government is not providing any service in this regard and it is not able to cover the costs of providing that service. By that same definition, it also excludes some of the tax concessions that say people might be getting for starting an industry, etc. So if you look at a holistic view, maybe those are also subsidies. So if say tax concessions to an industrialist, that can be classified as something which is undesirable. But in this classification, the subsidies are defined as something which are unrecovered costs on a service that is already provided. Does that make sense to you, Sarthak?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And again, they have talked about the subsidies, but they have also talked about the total costs. I mean, they are saying that subsidies is basically the difference between the cost that you incurred on some of the services and minus the amount of money that you are able to recover, right? So that is
Exactly, yeah. So the unrecovered costs, right? So that's what
unrecovered
it is.
costs.
So yeah, this
And this basically this
yeah, so that's an elegant definition that we can work with. And based on this number is what they found out that 1991 and in this 1987-88 budget, the size of these subsidies was nearly 13% of India's GDP.
Yeah.
And good trend is that actually this bill has reduced over the years. So by 2015-16, it had, instead of 13% GDP, it had become 10% GDP. So as an absolute number, it has definitely increased manifold. But as a percentage of GDP, and given that the Indian government's expenditure as a proportion of GDP has been constant around 25-26%. So with that in mind, what it means is that as a proportion of total government expenditure, we have seen a decline in subsidies actually from 1991.
Yeah, and here, Pranay, I want to point out one more thing. So if you break this thing further, right, merit subsidy as proportion of GDP, non-merit subsidy as proportion of GDP, the non-merit subsidy as proportion of GDP has seen a large decline as compared to the merit subsidy as proportion of GDP. So merit subsidy is more or less same, 4.6% to 4.5%, while the non-merit component, it has decreased from 8.3% to 5.7%.
Yeah. So at this point, let's define merit and non-merit. So since in the earlier episodes you had already discussed the definition of merit and non-merit subsidy, here for the purposes of this exercises, the authors classified 4 things under merit goods, which were food, education, health, water supply, and sanitation. So these based on either because they are, some of them are public goods, and mostly actually a lot of them are classified as merit because they have significant positive externalities, right? The benefit of a good public health system are large, shared by people, even people who are, let's say, not vaccinated. So there are massive benefits to people who are not directly addressed by the government as well, and that's why they can be classified as merit goods. Would you add anything else to this list?
I think infrastructure they are not included, right?
No.
Yeah, maybe infrastructure because it also has positive externalities. Maybe we can.
Yeah, that can be included as a merit good. Yes. Yeah. In general, the way we think of it is anything which is a private good, which affects only one person, is not the best way to classify as a merit good. And of course, all this is contextual. What will be a merit good in the European Union and probably in Denmark will not be a merit good in India, just because Indian government will have many more priorities to address. So it's a question of priorities rather than saying that something is non-meritorious. It just means that at this point of time, it is not the highest priority of the government. So for example, food is meritorious good that the government needs to provide in India. It might not be a meritorious good maybe 15-20 years henceforth when India is doing well and probably the poverty levels are significantly lower than what they are. So this is contextual, and in today's context, probably this set makes sense to classify these as merit goods. Okay, so now let's come to the non-merit subsidies part. So what's the size of that?
Non-merit subsidy, again, it was 8.3% 30 years back. Now it has become around 5.7%, right? So it has declined by almost 20%. So we have seen large decrease in the non-merit subsidy component. But still now...
Yeah, so that's a positive sign. That's a positive sign, definitely. But it is still a big number.
Still, it's a big number. And one thing here, if you look at how the subsidies are provided by the union and the state, right? Large part of the non-merit subsidies, right? They're provided by the state governments. So that is again a cause of concern. A large component of the subsidies provided by the union government is merit subsidies, while for the states it is non-merit subsidies. So states again have to play a role over there.
Yeah, so that's an important point. Yes, so somewhat I have to agree with what the PM mentioned, that state governments do have a role to play in reducing non-merit subsidies, because clearly it's 60% of that 6% GDP. So approximately you can say 4% GDP is going on non-merit subsidies incurred by the state government. So they do need to get their act together on this point, right? And yeah, I mean, union government can also do things. So in the 2% GDP on their non-meritorious subsidies, we there are also big items, right? So for example, we know fertilizer subsidy has had several ill effects, and that's something that the union government can get rid of if it wants to reduce its own freebies problem.
Yeah. So Pranay, should we take a break now?
Right.
Welcome back after the break. So we know that there exists subsidy problem, and the quantum of subsidy tends to be high, and the proportion of non-merit subsidy continues to be large. And again, states are the ones who bear a large part of the non-merit subsidy. So what do you think can be potential solutions? Again, one is maybe how to reduce the subsidies, or maybe there can be some deep fiscal reforms, or maybe something related to targeting.
Right. So before we go into that, Sarthak, I think a common question that people would ask is that, in today's world, even laptop is necessary for progress, and probably they are true, right? Internet, or basically any laptop, or even cycles provide a lot, because of, say, girl children having cycles, they are able to reach schools, and there is a positive benefit because of that. So what is wrong with the government providing cycles, or what is wrong with the government providing a mixer grinder or something like that? So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So again, if government is providing for some of these things, we should always keep in mind what is the opportunity cost, right? If X amount of money is being spent on cycles, maybe, right, that X amount of money could have been spent on something else. So that is something we have to keep in mind. I'll just give you one example again, that this might make things clearer, I guess. So just think of education, for example. Within education, again, there are different components: primary education, secondary education, higher education, and again, culture and other aspects are also there. Now, how much amount of money are you spending on primary education? How much amount of subsidy is being given to primary education? How much amount of subsidy is being given to higher education? Now, let's say the subsidy given to higher education is more than the subsidy given to primary education. Does it make sense? What should be the priority of the government? First thing is
Primary education, yeah.
I mean, if people do not have access to primary education, they will not be able to have access to secondary education, right? Very few people will be going to that stage where they can avail the subsidy. So
Yeah.
you have to think of the opportunity cost here. You have to also think about what should be the priority here. Similarly, another way to think of it, if let's say the aim of subsidy is to target people who are more vulnerable, or people who do not have access to basic services, right? Let's say you're targeting your subsidies. Now, it can be in different ways. Maybe you are providing subsidies for health sector. Now, just think of it, right? Whether, let's say this is protective or preventive health, right? Whether these subsidies should be, large part of the subsidies should be targeted to the rural areas, or large part of the subsidies should be targeted to the urban areas, right? And again, there were some, the papers look at some of these numbers, the Dr. Rao's paper specifically, and they find out that health subsidies were being targeted to the urban sector as compared to the rural areas. But in the rural areas, more people needs these services maybe. And again, the kind of services they already have is quite suboptimal. So the point is, for everything there is an opportunity cost, right? If you are spending more money here, you are losing out on some other things, and which might be the policy priority of the government, which should be ideally be the policy priority of the government.
Yeah, right. So, Sarthak, I'll extend it and say there are actually two reasons. One, continuing what you said on opportunity cost. Why is it important is also because of the marginal cost of public finance, right? So, we know that for every rupee that the government earns and then spends, the cost to the society is nearly 3. This is from Ajay Shah and Vijay Kilkar's book, this estimate, right? So, which means that for every rupee that the government is raising, the cost to society is significantly larger. So that's why the priority setting is important. You would want the government to spend money on areas where the benefit of government spending is more than rupee 3, and that is what we call merit goods, or you can say public goods. All these are areas where the assumption is that if the government spends money on those, the benefits to society will be more than rupees 3. So contrast that with, let's say, government which used to run Air India and spend so much money on Air India. The benefit to that society, the cost was more than rupee 3 for every rupee that the government spent on Air India, and definitely the benefit of that wasn't more than rupee 3 to the society. So it's a loss making investment, and also, as you said, there's an opportunity cost to it. So every 3 rupees that the government took away from the society was not spent on an area which was probably of more importance, these merit goods, for instance, right? So that's like one major reason why it is important for government to prioritize spending. Second, and I think this is also important, is that subsidy, as microeconomics, what we learn is, if you give a subsidy to a particular good, what will happen is that the consumption of that good will increase. Now that can also have significant ill effects, right? So for example, we talk about fertilizer subsidy. Now, because the government provided subsidy to urea initially, right, and that was all good in the name of, okay, we really needed lot of those inputs for the green revolution, etc. So given that it didn't have a sunset clause, it had many other effects, right? For example, one, it led to overconsumption of urea over time. It led to an ecological problem there. Second, because it was subsidized, and urea is this fantastic product which can be used for making paints, it can be used for various other purposes, industries. So what happened is that people used to pose as farmers, and then they started diverting urea to a lot of other sectors which had nothing to do with farming. And then that led to the government then forming a fertilizer control movement order in 1973, I think. And with that, the government actually did a central management of all fertilizer production. They used to calculate how much each state needs, and then the government used to determine which state gets what amount of urea. And then obviously, you know what happens when such controls are established. There was a lot of rent seeking, there was a lot of diversion, etc., which still continue. So the fact that you had a subsidy for this led to many other effects that actually made it difficult for many farmers to get hold of the fertilizer itself. So I think that is another reason why subsidy itself might not be the best way to address a problem, even when you acknowledge that there is a problem. Lots of people do need lots of things, but you should reserve using subsidy to very, very meritorious goods itself, right? So now let's come to the final part, right? So if subsidy is not the best way, what are the other ways? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So one way is, again, maybe provide for direct benefits. So instead of giving for some goods, your target, instead of providing for some goods, maybe you can just give cash to people, and they can themselves decide on the same, right, what they can do with it. Now, why do I say this? See, providing for subsidies and all these things, it becomes for example, this fertilizer subsidy and all those things, there's heavy intervention from the side of the government. Food subsidy, for example, there are so many departments, ministries who are engaged in all these things. So if you are just providing for direct benefits, and again, the assumption here is there are some people who need these services, maybe who are extreme poverty levels, maybe they need some form of help from the government, and maybe provide them with direct cash transfers instead of a subsidy.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you think of it as 6% GDP is going into non-meritorious subsidies, imagine a world in which at least half of that, 3% GDP is used as basic income, etc., in place of these subsidies. So it will be a significant improvement for people then to decide on their own what to do with it. And I think probably this solution was not possible 50 years ago, when we couldn't identify people, we didn't have the technology to do that. But now we can do that reasonably well, right? So I think lots of people have argued how that PM Kisan scheme can actually be extended to a large number of people, not just farmers, and that would do the job of what a basic income would do. Of course, it won't be universal given our fiscal constraint, but there are intelligent ways to eliminate that, the what you call the universality of it without hampering the fact that you are able to help the needy. There will be leakages, but I guess what positive thing out of all this debate to me is that probably now it will become a political plank for some party to use, so maybe if they can use this number and say that I will provide so much money in your hands instead of me running these subsidies, I think this is something which will benefit India, and it can actually be a political plank as well for someone to use. So that is one way out. I think the other institutional thing that again lots of public financial specialists have written, 14th Finance Commission has also proposed, is this idea of the fiscal council, an independent fiscal council, which at least puts out into the public domain, ex ante, not after a subsidy is announced and a CAG does a report 10 years later, but when a subsidy is announced by the government, an independent fiscal council just putting out the numbers, that this is how much it will cost, these are the real costs of doing something like that. Maybe people will also do opportunity cost assessments of those kinds of expenditures. That would at least lead to a more informative discussion instead of just discussions on political grounds where people are saying that, everything is good, government providing everything from a cycle to a laptop benefits people, so government should do it, right? That I think leads to a discussion which is devoid of the public finance understanding of government spending. So that I think would be another intermediate step which might help in this.
Yeah, Pranay, apart from just thinking of having a subsidy or not having a subsidy, right? There's another way to also think of it. Maybe make things more efficient. I'll just give an example, and especially when the way we are computing subsidies here, right? One of the thing is how much amount of money is being spent on different kind of public sector enterprises. It can be at the state level and the union level, right? So that is also kind of subsidy, right? You are spending money on it, there is a recovery, but the recovery tends to be quite low. So one of the possible solution, extreme solution is shut down the public sector enterprises. Intermediate solution is find out ways by which the recovery rate becomes better. At least improve the performance of these public sector enterprises so that whatever is the resource drain that is there, right, it is reduced over a period of time.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of public sector enterprises should just be sold off, right? In that sense, I don't think there is any intermediate step even required for that. And given that now there is a lot broader understanding of the fact that unless you are having a strategic need for that particular commodity, you don't need, there's no point of government owning it, right? So I guess that would also help.
And also, different states, right, the amount of subsidies they provide, per capita subsidy they provide, their performance is different. So let's say they're providing subsidies for education, for health, but their performance in terms of health, in terms of education is also different. So one of the things that needs to be done is the state should basically identify why they're less efficient as another state which is also at similar levels of development. They're able to ensure better bang for the buck. Why are they not able to do it? Right? So improving state capacity, figuring out why you are more inefficient might also be one of the things. But again, it has to be come from the state level.
That's true. Yeah, and I think for listeners who are interested, that all state governments do put out in the budget documents, there is a page on subsidies. These are explicit subsidies. They don't include implicit subsidies, but they do include a lot of things that people can analyze and then raise awareness on what is the cost of this. So I think it is good that this debate has been rekindled and that people are discussing about freebies, subsidies, what it is not. I don't think anyone has the answers, but it is good that we've begun a discussion on it, because we definitely know that 6% of GDP going on non-merit subsidies at our stage of development, where the state needs to do really core things which it doesn't do well, is a big problem. So with that, we will end this episode. Thank you, Sarthak.
Thanks, Pranay.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.